Okay. Uh, Hello, all of you. And as I told you, that we are going to begin today with PB Shelley. I've given you enough time to go through all the lectures on Victor Frankenstein and also in Frankenstein, and I hope you would have gone through the lectures. I mean, I can see that not many have watched the entire lectures and videos. Um there is something called YouTube analytics, which tells me that not many have watched the entire thing because it tells you the kind the duration uh, for which uh, any video has been viewed. So that is the benefit of that. Now I know that it is difficult to focus on studies, academics in the given times, and it becomes a little hard to focus on something as distant from us as a novel or a poem, and there are other things concerning us which we see in news, etc. Uh, but honestly, it is difficult, but we still have to do this. And I'm sure that you must also be spending a lot of time doing a lot of other things besides worrying about the coronavirus and all the things that are happening. So I'm sure you can give at least some time to your studies. And I'm not saying this for everybody. And uh, you can, do a lot more uh, in this time. Not make yourself a workaholic or anything and be callous and careless about what's happening in the world outside. Be concerned about it, but do use your time a little more fruitfully as well. Okay. Justify your uh, usage of time to some extent. Okay. And particularly, if you look at, uh, I began with this also thinking about the fact that a lot of the concerns which we have, or a lot of the concerns which are raised in our texts, in our course, in our uh, discipline of humanities, literature, etc. Please don't keep it as something only for the exams or something on which you will write papers or whatever answers, assignments. Try to use them as entry points into thinking about uh, a lot of the things that we encounter in our real day-to-day life in the world outside. So I think that's what makes our paper relevant. Frankenstein, I hope, would have made you question and would have made you take note of a lot of the concerns which uh, directly affect us vis-a-vis science, the development of technology, the development of artificial intelligence, and what it is doing to us as human beings, how we approach uh, our own selves, or rather, how we approach uh, or understand our connection to ourselves and to the society, the world that we inhabit, not just the human society, but the world at large, which includes plants, animals, and everything else. Okay, so if you're not able to, if you're not willing to think on those lines, those terms, then perhaps this remains a purely academic exercise, and that reading of literature, poetry, etc., becomes, remains limited to the textbooks and your answer sheets and nothing beyond, and grades and nothing beyond that. So, and I think that would be wasting too much time in just acquiring uh, a grade or a degree, and uh, it won't really, benefit you in the long run if you're not able to link or think about uh, other things that affect us while uh, getting educated about any text or any field of knowledge for that matter. So that is one thing. If I just go back to Victor Frankenstein and his pursuit, etc., one thing that Mary Shelley criticizes Victor Frankenstein for is that he does not acquire a humanist education. He becomes a purely scientific uh, a creature of a scientific pursuit, etc., etc., and does not, or rather, in a sense, he shuns and goes away from his interest in poetry, thinking about the larger questions about human life, human engagement, and by that, in a sense, denouncing his denouncing his interest in humanist education and from going away from humanist concerns at large. So that's with Frankenstein and how why is it important to study that text in the current times. Okay, coming to P.B. Shelley, the husband of Mary Shelley and a prolific poet, again uh, lived for a very short while. I've given you the details of his birth and uh, not his birth, rather his very details about the time period which he lived and some of his important works. However, those are not that is not an exhaustive list of Shelley's works by any means. Okay, I've shared a link with you, and of course you can go through the very basic information about Shelley and his works from the introduction given in the book, and I'll not spend much time on that. Few things to mention about Shelley is that uh, uh, he was expelled from college for writing an essay called The Necessity of Atheism. So he was against uh, organized religion, much like Blake, etc., and a more vociferous critic of uh, religious doctrines, so on and so forth, and somewhat in the line of William Blake, he too thought of religions as and religious scriptures as poetic myths or myths through which human beings understand uh, their existence, their relation to the world, and uh, in a sense, uh, religious scriptures, religious mythology becomes a kind of a grand narrative through which you make sense of or give meaning to your own existence, so on and so forth. So these are some of his ideas, and of course, a defense of poetry. The notes on which I have shared with you, please go through them. Is an important a theoretical text of P.B. Shelley, and it's important to go through that first before you watch these lectures and go through the poems, because it will give you a perspective through which you can look at the poems in our syllabus. Okay. Where he takes, I mean, a defense of poetry is, in a sense, is a defense of poetry and why it is useful in the romantic period. How he challenges the claim uh, of Plato that poets should be expelled from the ideal republic because they talk in metaphors and in a language uh, which, in a sense, makes poetry twice removed from the real. We'll come to all of that discussion in a little while when we come to the other two poems, the second, the latter two poems in our syllabus. And of course, you should also take a look. Please do take a look at his the excerpts from a view of philosophical reforms, which I have shared with you again, where you will find how P.B. Shelley is critical of dictatorships, how he is a champion for democratic reforms, rule of the people, of change, etc., And why, and he also feels that in the current times which he inhabits in England, that there is a necessity for greater freedom and more participation of the public in the sphere of governance. He was also a champion for Irish independence. He wrote a pamphlet for the same. He also talked about the necessity for uh, the Greeks to overthrow the Ottoman Empire. Okay, some of these things are going to come up in our poems, and we'll go through them in more detail. Okay, uh, so before without uh, any further ado, let's look at the very first poem in our syllabus, and you'll get a hang of what P.B. Shelley is like. And Ozymandias is the first poem which we have in our syllabus, and you would find that uh, it is not a typical P.B. Shelley poem, and in a sense, it is not a philosophical poem of that kind where the primary subject of the poem is the poet and the poetic mind, and its a negotiation with the material and the spiritual. That is something that you would find as a prominent feature of most romantic writing. P.B. Shelley is no different. Okay, the more philosophical engagement with the self and its relation to the world which the self inhabits. Spiritual world, metaphysical world, also the material world. We've seen that a few times already. Okay, this poem, okay, before going, talking much about the poem, let's just read the poem closely. It was written in 1817. Okay, poem begins thus. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well who those passions read which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Okay, so it's a very short poem, and what we find in this poem, firstly, this poem is by and large in the voice of a traveler whom the poet persona meets. The traveler is from an antique land, most likely Egypt. Okay. Um, Also, ancient Egypt, antique connotes as that connotation. The poem is about Ozymandias, the sculpture of Ozymandias, its remains, uh, which are left after the sculpture has been shattered, and some words inscribed on the sculpture. Okay. So, in a sense, there are three voices in the poem if you take a closer look at it. One is that of the poet, okay. The other is that of the traveler from the antique land. And the third is the inscription, which is supposedly the words in which Ozymandias wants himself to be remembered and understood. Okay. So, as you must have noticed from the poem, it is a kind of a warning. Okay. And how is it a warning? What is it all about? Let's take a closer look at the poem and see. So, firstly, take a look at the note. You'll find that Ozymandias is the Greek name for Ramses II, the pharaoh of Egypt with whom Moses fought during the Exodus. And there's a detail of when the poem was written. Ramses II is known for his fierce wars with the Libyans and his extensive building projects, as well as the many colossal statues of him throughout Egypt. Shelley chooses Egyptian culture because it far antedates Greek Italian culture. Okay, it's a the interest in antiquity, the interest in the Oriental uh, antique lands is a typical feature again of the late 18th century and early 19th century, the Romantic period. Okay, uh, that's why he's choosing Egypt as a site for a warning about a project of great domination, great monumentalization of authority. Okay, this is a poem about the warning is what? The warning is that uh, any human endeavor which claims itself to be timeless, uh, permanent, is a fallacy because it is ultimately going to suffer the ravages of time and would be destroyed. Okay, now take a look at the poem, word line by line, very carefully. I met a traveler from an antique land. Okay, so firstly, what we read from here on is in the words of the traveler. Okay, so Shelley is saying, I'm not saying this. There's a traveler who's recounting this tale to me. So, in a sense, in this poem, you would find that Shelley is not making a clear sort of a judgment in a sense, as a statement. The lesson that time overpowers any supposedly quote unquote great human endeavor, that lesson is not stated as a clear statement or not as an as a as a emphatic word of the poet, but it is deduced, this lesson is deduced from the tale, the anecdote from the traveler, which is recounted in the poem. Okay, so I met a traveler from an antique land. Now, for all reason, there is little reason for us to disbelieve the account of the traveler. Okay, he's coming from an antique land, so it is not Shelley's view about Egypt or Ramses. It is the traveler's account, okay, which we are going to read now. And an antique land, this antique now could mean either Egypt as an antique land, as a land which is geographically distant and is antique in the sense that, I mean, uh, it is not the modern England. Okay, it's antique in that sense, although geographically distant in the present time. Okay, uh, or it is also something. The word antique also connotes the idea of a past great time, not great necessarily, but a past age, a past time period from which this artifact of Ozymandias sculpture is, uh, uh, in a sense, emerging, or rather, is from. Okay, basically, the Ozymandias sculpture is from an antique land, is a remnant relic from an antique past of Egyptian history. Okay, okay, and from the note you also find, you get to know about the nature of Ozymandias. Okay, this great ancient ruler is famous for his fierce wars and for his building projects, and also the colossal statues of his own self, which were probably made to, in a sense, in his memory. He could have commanded it himself. Uh, that is a typical feature of the megalomaniac emperor. Okay. Uh, and what do we find in the narration or the anecdote of the traveler. Also, keep in mind that this was a period where Orientalism, the interest in Orientalism were there, the interest in the anecdotes about distant lands of different cultures was very, very prominent. Okay. Kubla Khan is again a different sort of an example of an Oriental despot that if you remember from your reading of Coleridge. Okay. So he says, the traveler says, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. So there are two legs. Okay, it's not a complete sculpture that remains. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies. A shattered face. So you can imagine a big statue only with its legs now standing in the desert. The face is severed, or the head is severed from the top and is lying half sunken in the desert. And what is the expression on the face of the sculpture? Half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell. Okay, we'll come to the tell part later. The expression on the face of this tyrant Ozymandias is that of a frown, a wrinkled lip, arrogance, condensation, and a sneer of cold command is visible from his face. Okay. So basically his head has been severed from his shoulders. His body is in a sense shattered into pieces. His sculpture is the monument symbolic of his greatness, his power. It has been shattered. It is lying in pieces. His face sunken in the sand, half sunken. Yet something is concretely visible still, and that is his expressions of cold command, arrogance, power, tyranny. And what is the traveler adding to this description further is that because the expressions of the tyrant still remain captured in the facial expressions of the sculpture, it tells something about the sculptor, the person who in a sense made that object, monument. Tell that its sculpture, or rather I'll read it again, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive. That the sculptor was able to read quite well the passions of this tyrant which yet survive. Now there is a curious sort of formulation here, which yet survive. Now this means, as we read in the following lines, yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. Okay, so these in a sense still survive in the creation of the sculpture. The hand that mocked them, meaning the hand that mimicked them, that is the sculptor's hand or his art basically, it still survive in the sculptures, the sculptor's craft. Okay, the hand that mocked them, the expressions still survive in that work of art, okay, that created them, and the heart that fed, that is the heart of the tyrant, which in a sense fed these expressions to himself, and they are in a sense, they are hence visible on his shattered visage. Okay, but this formulation which yet survive is very curious. It also is in a sense, if you are an alert reader, you would be able to identify a kind of warning, in a sense that these passions yet survive, in a sense they continue to survive in our present age. That is the kind of sense that you can, uh, in a sense, you get from reading these lines. Okay, and sneer of cold command, tell that its sculptor, well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. Now these lifeless things could apart from being the lifeless statue, the broken lifeless parts, body parts of uh, uh, that is a statue of Ozymandias, but also the lifeless things which you might still see around yourself in the present times, which are symbolic of these passions of cold command, arrogance, power, tyranny, the ambition of human pursuits, okay, which are visible in, say, the great monuments that human beings, human civilizations build, okay, the big palaces or uh, institution, or rather buildings made by every government of every land to leave a stamp or a mark of their authority, which they hope would survive the passage of time, the ages of time. Okay. Okay, so it might take a few hundred years, a few decades, or a few thousand years, or a millennia, but ultimately time has its own say. Okay, so that's and this is a warning that can be read from the account of the traveler's account about Ozymandias and the sculpture, which yet survives stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, that is the sculptor's hand which made them, and the heart that fed, that is the craft, which is, or rather the person, that is Ozymandias, in a sense, that fueled those passions. So both in a sense, in again, the heart that fed could also be symbolic of, in a sense, symbolic of the tyrannical heart which still persists in modern times. Okay. It is, in a sense, also symbolic of, what I mean to say is that those human passions which still persist, irrespective of time. I mean, if you remember our reading of Frankenstein, you'll find that there is, in the preface, there was a talk about uh, facets of human nature, which that novel is trying to encapsulate in this, in the narrative. Okay, the follies, the the good and the evil of human nature, uh, which the novel talks about. Here also you can find the similar sort of an idea: the heart that fed and the hand that mocked them. You still have uh, artists, craftsmen, architects who, in a sense, uh, build monuments and uh, would write eulogies of uh, the tyrants and the dictators of every age. Okay, and it's always been the case. Okay, so which yet survives, stamped on these lifeless things, those passions, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. So those passions still survive in the 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 recorders of those passions in their works of art, and also, of course, the people who harbor those passions, they still survive. And of course, the sculpture, the shattered sculpture, that still survives. And there is also something written on the pedestal, and on the pedestal these words appear: my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains. Nothing beside remains. Okay, now my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. So this is megalomania, which is, I mean, you think that you are in a sense the greatest of the greatest, and nobody has been as good as you, and nobody ever will be as powerful and great as you are. Find it in all dictators and tyrants of all ages. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Look on my works again means that the great monuments that Ozymandias had commissioned as an emperor, okay, to in a sense stamp his authority on his reign and of his reign on history, okay, that his monuments in a sense would be a reminder of his greatness for the ages and the generations to come. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Okay. Nothing beside remains. All the uh, great works that he has is what all is, and nothing beside remains. Okay. Now, this could also mean that, or this could also be read as an irony in the sense that nothing beside remains. What there is an in a sense an irony there, because what we find from the account of the traveler about Ozymandias and his sculpture is that nothing beside remains other than his shattered statue, which is also in pieces. The only thing that remains is that expression of tyranny, cold command, usurpation on captured on his face, which is half sunk in the sand. Okay, ultimately to be submerged in sand for good. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. This is how the traveler concludes his description. That around the decay of that colossal wreck of Ozymandias, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. The sands are boundless, okay, and bare and level, and that's they stretch far away. I mean, far and wide. In a sense, what is this spatial sort of or the spatial metaphors or language imagery? What does it evoke? Okay. Now, like any tyrant, any ruler, Ozymandias would want, in a sense, would have wanted, or rather, any tyrant, any dictator, any ruler would want that his reign is remembered forever. It's timeless, and that he conquers the entire world in a sense. Okay, that's where spatiality comes in. That he occupies the space which is under his reign, and he draws his power from the space that he has conquered. Okay, the amount of land that is under his reign, and the kind of symbols he's able to erect on that land. The idea is also take your mind back to Kubla Khan, that twice 5 miles of land he ordered to be fenced and build his great palace. Okay. Now he also, in a sense, Ozymandias would want to confine, or rather his own, in a sense, if you look at it in another way, any ruler, any tyrant, any dictator is unable to see beyond the limits of the land he occupies and the time period he is ruling for. He thinks that this is all the world, and his kingdom is basically all the world, and it is going to be there forever, etc. Okay, but what is the contrast here? That his own shattered visage is lying there on a land which is now boundless because it is a stretch of sand, It is bare, there are no monuments, it is lone, there is nobody, no subjects he is ruling over now. Thing is gone, and they are level. Okay, in a sense, a leveling of human ambition, of any tyrant's claim to perpetual, permanent glory and power and authority has been leveled to ground by time. Okay, so these are the ironies that are working in this very short poem, and uh, read it very, very carefully and see how these imageries work in a very ironic sort of sense. And again, you will not find any statement from the poet per se. The most of the poem, barring the first line, is the words of a traveler who is giving you, in a sense, a first-hand account of what he saw in Egypt. Now, what is the warning here? The warning is that uh, if this could happen to an emperor, an authoritarian king, dictator like Ozymandias of some BCE, so he's from centuries old, thousands of years ago, uh, why wouldn't that happen to any great human, supposedly great uh, imperial pursuit of the modern times? And Shelley, as I've just told you, was against uh, empire, this idea of empire, the idea of, in a sense, uh, building colonies and exploiting them, and uh, of uh, tyrannical rules, even in within the British Isles, even in a place like, say, Ireland. And in the next poem, you'll also find how, in a sense, he is also critical of the Ottoman reign. Okay, and uh, and you should read these poems, in a sense, although it is talking about an antique time period, it is also, in a sense, putting into perspective the politics of the modern times, which Shelley is very much concerned about. And in his poems, you'll find not there are not many direct, in a sense, uh, references to his contemporary politics, unlike what you'll find probably in, say, the Chimney Sweeper poems of William Blake. Here you'll find an indirect sort of a critique through the imageries of nature, of time, space, etc. Okay, so I hope you liked this poem, and uh, that you would uh, read this poem closely, think about it, and also make note of that there are also these multiple voices in the terms of there is the poetic voice which is putting this poem together for you in perspective, and then the voice of uh, the traveler, okay, and the written words of Ozymandias. Okay, so this is also, in a sense, a poem about the function of art, in a sense, or uh, should make you think about uh, what is art, in a sense. This work of art, that is the sculpture of Ozymandias, might have been commissioned by Ozymandias himself for his own commemoration, for his own eulogization of his own self, his greatness, but the work of art remains over a period of time, and from being a panegyric or a eulogy to or an epitome of the greatness, supposed greatness of a king, is the Egyptian king. Now, by the Romantic period, it has now become to function as a warning, a critique of uh, the idea of authoritarian rule and tyranny and imperial rule. Okay, so the function of the art, in a sense, changes according to time, and in a sense, so ultimately, the piece of the work of art itself here becomes a critique. From being a celebration of one idea, it becomes a critique of the same idea uh, in our modern times. Okay, so please read this poem and do send in your doubts and queries, and um, soon enough, either by tomorrow or today itself, I'll move on to the next poem. All right. Thank you, and hope to have more of your doubts and queries. And please keep reading. Thanks.